Introduction of Mark. And so Mark is currently a professor at EPFL, a full professor. There he directs the Geometric Computing Lab, the GCM. And then prior to EPFL, he was an assistant professor at ETH Zurich. He was a postdoctoral scholar at Stanford University and a doctoral student at ETH Zurich. He received the ETH Zurich ETH Medal for Outstanding Dissertation and was also one of the Eurographics Young Researcher Award. And more importantly, an ERC grant that started in 2010. And the Eurographics Outstanding, something's going on with my computer here, but the Eurographics Outstanding Technical Contributions Award in 2016. Now he's also co-founder of two EPFL spinoffs, Phase Shift AG and Rayform SA. And I'll give a couple of my impressions of Mark. I met Mark probably about 6 or 7 years ago when I visited EPFL, and I was just blown away at the elegance with which he combines computer science with architecture, design, and art. I don't know where he lies on that spectrum because I think he's an excellent computer scientist, but the art, in my opinion, is remarkable. And so I'm really excited to have him give a talk here, and I'm really excited about some of the cool things we'll get to see. So I know we can't really welcome him with an applause, but I'll do an applause on behalf of all of you at the University of Michigan here. So Mark, you can take it away.
Well, thanks so much for the introduction, and it's of course a great pleasure to be able to present to you today. I mean, of course, even more enjoyable would have been to visit you and see your place and get to meet you in person. But I'll try to do my best to at least show you some of our work, and then I'd be happy to discuss more after the talk if people want to stick around, or if some of the things that I talk about today you find interesting. Shoot me an email. I'd be happy to talk more at some later stage as well. And hopefully, there will be an opportunity sometime later to also visit you and meet you all in person. So as Evgeny was saying, I'm from EPFL. This is a view of our campus. It's very beautiful, right at the Lake of Geneva. And today I'm going to give you an overview of some of our work. And of course, this is not my work. Oh, this Zoom is constantly switching back. Okay, this is the work of my team, and this is the current team in the lab. And I also have a few people that left recently whose work I'm also going to talk about. They all went on to faculty positions in the US, actually. So they should definitely be acknowledged. Before getting started, I wanted to give you sort of a brief overview of our playing fields. I'm in computer science. My background is in computer science, specifically computer graphics, and this is sort of our core domain. But I'm very interested in fabrication, and especially sort of the modern digital fabrication technology and what it enables us to do. We are interested in applications, specifically sort of in the space of architecture, art, and design, also to kind of keep us grounded and validates our computational work in the real world, so to speak. And as Evgeny was saying, I'm personally very inspired by art and nature. Geometry is my thing, and I walk through the world and see beautiful geometry in nature, in artwork. And very often, and a number of the projects that I'm going to show you today have been triggered by either an art piece or an observation in nature that somehow made me curious, to understand whether this is something that we can understand and utilize in some way, and maybe do some computation with. And of course, we're interested in fabrication and the rapid development in fabrication technology. We're not necessarily ourselves inventing new fabrication techniques, although we do tinker quite a bit with the machines that we have and try to also anticipate, new developments in fabrication and link it to computation. So as I said, our background is in computer science. So we're very interested in geometry representations, how to represent shapes. We'll draw a lot from sort of classical differential geometry. I'll show you some examples of that. We're interested also in abstract shape spaces. What does it mean for a certain set of constraints to define the specific shape space that we want to navigate in? And then a lot of our work has to do with optimization, translating maybe high-level objectives into low-level optimizable functions. We build our own numerical solvers because we're interested in the geometry of the physical world. We actually simulate a lot of physical systems. And then we also build tools that allow people to interact and design and explore, various kinds of material systems. And today I want to talk specifically about a streak of research that we've done in the last couple of years on inverse design methods, and more specifically on deployable structures. So I'll show you 4 projects, and I'm probably, for some of them, I'm going to stay a bit on the surface, but I'll try to convey the key messages that are actually quite similar across these projects. So this is something that hopefully will become clear. But to get started, I first want to set the stage by talking a little bit by what I mean with inverse design. And when we talk about inverse design, it's good to talk about forward design first, before we talk about the inverse of the process. And I want to show a very simple example, just to illustrate a little bit the kind of setup that we're dealing with. So imagine you're throwing a ball, right? So you throw the ball and you can simulate or try out physically and see where it lands, right? So here we have a system where I can maybe define a very precise goal, a sort of performative objective, if you will. I want to hit a certain point on this plane. And of course, I have parameters that I can manipulate. And this is what I call my design space. For example, I can add more force to my throw, right? And that will get me maybe closer or further away from my objective. I could also change the angle. So these here, in this very simplified example, are the 2 parameters that I can vary. This is where I can change my design, if you will, by changing these 2 parameters. And if I pick a specific point in this design space, in this example, very simple 2-dimensional space, then now I can run this simulation to evaluate it. Right? I can run a forward simulation, check whether I hit my target, and in that way evaluate my design. Now, this simulation can be quite complicated, right? This can involve complex PDEs, for example, some things that are not so trivial to do. And in the end, I have to evaluate how good my design is. And of course, in this trivial example, I have a very simple objective. I just want to know how far I am from the target that I set. But in general, in design, you have many more and sometimes conflicting objectives. So in this performance space that you really care about, the space where you would evaluate your design, complexity can already be quite different. So you can design in this way by basically just choosing parameters, running your simulation, and evaluating the design. That's what I would call forward design, where you directly manipulate the parameters that are at your disposal. But our goal will be to do inverse design. And that means that I specify my design target, and I try to make this in a way that it can be quantified, or at least the aspects of my design that can be quantified. And now I want to invert this process and find the parameters in my design space that actually meet my objective. Or if the objectives are conflicting, find some balance and some trade-off. And in this example, of course, this can give me various kinds of solutions that I can then explore further or evaluate further. Now, this type of abstraction is actually quite helpful to think about the kinds of problems that I want to talk about. So we have a design space. This is the space in which we can manipulate parameters that are accessible and exposed to us. So this is a set of continuous or discrete variables that I can change. Then I have some sort of process, a forward simulation, and I'll show you this very specifically in the context of our deployable structures, that allow me to evaluate this design and measure its performance. And performance could be many different things here. It could be shape, it could be structural stability, it could be visual, it could be aesthetics, many, many different things. And our goal is now to say, as a designer, it's actually much nicer and more intuitive to specify your performance criteria, to say what you want from the design. What is a good design? When is a design according to your needs? And then solve that inverse problem to find the design parameters. And these things are generally very hard, right? Why is this difficult? Because, in this toy example I showed you, I had 2 parameters. In general, we are often dealing with thousands or potentially millions of unknowns. And forward design in this space becomes completely infeasible. You cannot choose yourself 50,000 numbers to specify a design. It's just not practical. The forward simulation in itself can be very complex. Typically, we have to solve differential or integral equations in high-dimensional spaces. So this in itself is already difficult. The performance metric can be complex to evaluate. Usually you have global dependencies, meaning that changes in a few of your design variables can lead to drastic changes in your outcome. So this is in general intractable. if you specify most relevant, reasonable problems, you cannot really solve this in any meaningful way. So we have to really go in, and the two main ingredients in our work in some sense are to look at efficient ways to solve this. This is really I would say, numerical or computer science challenge. But then the key thing that I would want to stress today is really that it's the geometry that matters, and the systems at least that we study. And I want to show you, or at least give you a glimpse of the kind of tools that we use to approach these difficult problems. So specifically today, I want to talk about deployable structures. These are things that have fascinated me for a long time. So what are deployable structures? Basically things that can transform from one state to another, basically changing their shape. And they appear in nature, they appear in industrial applications, they can appear in design and engineering, or even in architecture. So they can happen at many different scales with many different material systems. But the thing that is common to them is basically that there's a shape transformation happening. And that shape transformation has a function or meaning or use, right? So I want to walk you through a number of projects that we did in this space, starting off with a work on auxetics. And this is actually one of those examples that got triggered by design. So I stumbled into Design Store and I saw this kind of object, which is basically just a brass or copper plate with a specific pattern of incisions. And I was very intrigued. Normally such a metal plate would just be, you could bend it in one direction, be sort of a developable surfaces. But if you add incisions, you can actually deform this material into double curved shapes. So we're curious about this, and we made kind of our own copy. Auxetic basically means that this is a material with negative Poisson's ratio. If you stretch it in one direction, it also expands in the transversal direction. And this actually allows this normally single curvature type of material to assume a double curved shape. So we can wrap this around the sphere, which we could not do with this plastic sheet if it was not having these incisions. So the first thing that we do is kind of abstract this a little bit. And here this type of specific auxetic material can be represented by a triangular linkage with a specific pattern that you see here. And you can see this isotropic expansion that is going on. And if I go back to our inverse design formalization, then our design target is really that we want to deform this object or deploy this object into a specific target shape. And our metric in this sense becomes, how close does our material, that is of course constrained, as we will see, how close does it achieve that specific target? Our design space itself is the 2D sheet material, right? We want to cut out a piece of this material and figure out how it would deploy. So our forward simulation is that deployment, that deformation from the flat planar fabrication state to the 3D surface. So our input is actually the design surface, and our output is the 2D flat fabricated object. And this is a theme that we will see throughout, in the sense that we have a number of systems where we deploy from one state that is easy to fabricate into a 3D state that would be very difficult to fabricate directly, but that has interesting functions or aesthetics. So our goal is to solve this inverse problem. So here you see in this formulation that we're looking for the design parameters that minimize, in this case, this performance metric, the distance to the target surface. But you see it's sort of a nested loop, right? We have the forward simulation in the inner argument of that function. So how do you solve a problem like this, right? So this is a minimization problem. So, typically what you do with functions like this, you set the gradient to 0, right? That's a sort of necessary condition. If you add a minimum of this function, the gradient is 0. So you can do gradient descent, very basic method, which in our case would be, you have some initial, we have a target surface, let's say this scan of Max Planck, or a statue of Max Planck to be precise. And you have an initial guess of what you want to start with, maybe the sheet of material. And now you basically deform this sheet so that it matches the target. And you do gradient descent on this. Very basic, very easy. And gradient descent, of course, starts somewhere, in this case with this initial guess, and moves down the energy landscape until it hits a local minimum. The problem is, this doesn't work at all, right? If you run gradient descent on this kind of problem, it's sort of the sheet tries to wrap around this object and it's just terrible, right? And this is not very surprising because, this sort of simulation is a very nonlinear, very non-convex function, and you cannot hope to start at a random point and get to a good local minimum. So this is not a question of your numerical solver. It's really just fundamental to the problem. And what do we do? Well, geometry comes to the rescue. And this is sort of a big theme that we have in our research in general. We figure out ways to make this work by exploiting geometric insights we have about the problem. I'm going to do a quick detour, and I'm not completely sure, what everybody's background is, but I guess everybody's familiar with the concept of curvature, at least in some sense. What does it mean for a surface to be curved? Basically, we're looking at two types of curvature. Curvature in its first instance is defined for a curve, how much it deviates from a straight line. And if you generalize this idea to a surface, you end up with two types of curvatures that we often call the principal curvatures. And then their product is the Gauss curvature. When we talk about the curvature of a surface, typically we mean the Gauss curvature. There's other curvatures like mean curvature. But here I will mostly talk about Gauss curvature, which is the product of the two. And that allows you to classify, for example, surfaces. If I take a sheet of paper and I bend it, then the Gauss curvature is 0, and I can make so-called developable surfaces, cylinders, cones, things like that. Negatively curved surfaces are saddle points, and positively curved surfaces are sort of spherical or elliptical points. And now Gauss showed something that he himself called the remarkable theorem. And if Gauss says it's remarkable, you can be sure it truly is remarkable. And it's something that is not obvious at all and has very deep implication. And basically what he figured out is that the Gauss curvature is an intrinsic quantity. And that means that it's something that you can determine by only measuring distances on the surface. So if you have a way to measure distances on the surface, you can actually figure out what the curvature is. And this is not at all intuitive, because curvature in principle is a second order quantity, and length is a first order quantity. So why is this possible? I'm not going to go into the proof or more of the details, but I'm more going to talk about the consequences of this. Basically, what this means is that the metric, and meaning the ability to measure length on the surface, determines the curvature. And this is a principle we can now turn around. We can say, if we can change length, we can change surface curvature. So this is actually a principle that has been used a lot and in many different instances. Here's an example. Here's a heat-activated hydrogel. So as you heat this up, this surface will expand in the plane at different rates. So we're changing length across the surface. And if you do that, the surface buckles out of plane. In order to accommodate that change in length, it has to assume curvature, right? And there's many other examples like this. So we can control the shape of a flat piece by changing its length. This is also, for example, something that happens in nature a lot. If leaves grow, they grow at different rates in different parts. And the only way to accommodate that inconsistency is to buckle into 3D shape. And this is exactly the principle that we're going to exploit for our aesthetics. So we've seen from this regular linkage pattern that we have isotropic expansion. And this is something that we can abstract into a so-called conformal map. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this principle, but this is actually, it's a very deep sort of mathematical theme, but relatively easy to explain. It says that if the material expands isotropically, meaning at the same rate in all directions, then what's really happening is that locally the surface scales uniformly. So we will preserve angles. And if you look at this example here, the regular grid gets here in the plane transformed. The squares remain squares, but they change in size. So this is something you can also, of course, do from a 2D surface onto a 3D shape. So this is a mapping now from the plane into 3D that preserves angles, but changes distances. And here, this is something that people have developed in computer graphics, ways to compute these type of conformal maps for arbitrary surfaces. So we have a way to, given some 3D shape, compute this type of flattening in the plane. Now, there is something very interesting happening. A conformal map is a special kind of mapping from 2D to 3D, one that allows us to very explicitly write down the curvature as a function of that local length scale. So this is a famous formula in differential geometry. The specifics are not so important, but what it says is that the curvature, again, is related to the change in length. Here, this uniform scaling factor. And the Laplace operator in there says actually that it's the variation of scaling that matters, okay? So what this allows us to do is that we can control curvature and consequently the shape of our structure by varying the local expansion in our map. So if I take a regular triangulation like we had before, or if I take this auxetic and open it uniformly, there's actually no curvature, because here the scale factor is the same everywhere. And if I take the Laplacian of a constant, it's going to be 0. So Gaussian curvature is 0. So we can only achieve curvature if we let the opening vary across the surface. So here is an example. If we want to map this onto a sphere, then these openings are not uniform. They're not the same everywhere, but they vary. And this variation is precisely encoded in that shape. So what that means for us is that if we want to do an inverse design pipeline, going back to our gradient descent method, we're not starting with some random surface, but we're starting with a conformal map of our target surface, right? We apply this conformal mapping paradigm to get an initial guess for our optimization. And if we now do gradient descent, well, in practice, we do something more advanced, but if we could do gradient descent, now we actually get a solution that works, because we understand that in order to get to this shape, we need to get something that is close to a conformal map. So the conformal map gives us the initialization that we need. And if you compare this with the naive solution, where you start with no information or random guess, then of course the result is drastically different. And now we have a complete pipeline to do this. If you take an input shape, then you can just compute its conformal map, run our optimization, cut this out of a piece of copper, and deform this into the target shape. And it will fit. You know exactly how much you need to open each of those hexagonals to actually get to the shape. So you get the complete solution. Now, I told you about deployable structures. How do we deploy this? This is actually not deployed at all. This is just manually deformed by hand onto a mold surface. And to make this actually deployable, we have to take it a step further. So what we're doing here is really just creating a fixed type of material, right? All of these incisions are the same. The material doesn't know what shape it wants to go into. We have to give it that information by, for example, using a mold surface. So we need this external surface to actually tell the surface what it wants to deform into. And that makes deployment complicated, because you almost have to first make the surface to be able to deploy it into it. But what we can do, and it requires actually a very little change, is to encode the target surface, so the surface that our structure is supposed to deform into that 2D material. That's what we call sort of programmed material. And it's a simple trick. So what we've seen before is that if we want curvature, if we want to go from something flat into something that is more interesting and double curved, then we need to have variation in expansion. So on the left here, you see this material which has all identical triangles, but the openings change. We need more expansion in certain regions and less in others. We can achieve the same effect by actually changing the size of the triangles, but keeping the openings fully expanded. Okay, so this actually gives us sort of the same structure. It looks a bit different, but the underlying mechanism is more or less the same. What that means, though, is now that our material in its 2D state is not uniform anymore, right? We now have to create this specific material for this specific shape. But what it allows us to do is that we can now, so here you see this sort of variation. Some of these openings are already partially open, where we have less expansion, and where we have more expansions, we have bigger triangles that are more closed up. But now we have actually the target shape encoded. If we come up with a way to stretch the surface out as much as it can, then it will automatically go into the shape that we've programmed into it. And we explored sort of two types of actuation. One is inflation, and the other one is just using gravity. And I'll show you how that looks like. So here we have a target input surface, and the optimized result is shown on the right. We can now flatten this surface, of course. We cut it out of a piece of cardboard in this case. We build a little frame so we can inflate this, and we add a balloon, right? So this balloon you just inflate, it's a silicon rubber thing. It would go to whatever shape it wants to go, certainly not to the shape that we specified as input. But if we now add this material on top, then this balloon will now inflate exactly to the shape that we designed, because this material will stop moving once it's fully expanded. It cannot move anymore, right? This is the principle that we exploited here. So we've programmed this shape into that 2D material. And for some more restricted types of surfaces, you can even do this by just letting a structure hang, right? This is now a doubly curved structure with positive and negative curvature that just deploys automatically by gravity, because these tiles want to expand as much as they can. So here we have a programmed material, that's nice, but it requires active deployment. Okay, gravity is a cheap deployment, it's there all the time, unless you go to space. But inflation is something that if I turn off the pump, then this surface will go back to its original state. Why is that? Because the type of linkages that we use are sort of elastic, right? I can pull them apart, but then if I take off the force, they will just go back to where they started. And now we also, got aware of this type of bistable auxetic pattern, which actually is interesting in that it has a second state when it's fully opened that is also stable. So bistability here means that there's an energy barrier between the initial state that has zero energy and this deployed state, which has a higher energy, but it will still be stable because it's in a local minimum of the energy. So this is very simple, and we can extend this immediately to our framework. So here is an example of a bistable auxetics, which it's made out of silicon, a very flexible material, and just by injecting some energy, by shaking it, it deploys, but it now stays in that shape, because this is now again a state of local energy, local minimum energy. And this is actually quite nice, because now we don't need any inflation or any other force to keep this object in its target shape. And we explored a bunch of design studies. These are more like rendered things. We didn't go to Mars, actually. We didn't make any hard stands yet. But just to show that these auxetic materials have quite a bit of potential, because they start from something flat, right? They're planar, which makes them easy to fabricate, makes them very versatile, but they can be deployed into various things. But we have explored this a little bit in practice. So this is again an aerial view of our beautiful campus. And you notice there's some space here, and that space needs to be filled. So we designed an auxetic pavilion. This is a double layered structure made out of these auxetic elements. And it was a long process. We had to find money for it, but it is almost completed. So here are some early pictures. You see still the fence around it. It's not quite done. But this is a doubly curved structure that is deployed from a flat membrane. So, here it's of course at that scale, it needs to be assembled. We cannot cut this out of one piece. But it has some really interesting structural properties. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk more about this. Okay, wow, we're already like half an hour in. This is going to be interesting. So let me come to the second topic. Another type of deployable structure, inflatables. So we used inflation already for deploying auxetics, but here it's very different. We take two sheets of material and we fuse it along these orange curves. And this is what you get in an air mattress, basically, right? So you blow this up, it expands in the vertical direction, but it contracts in the other direction. And now an interesting question is, like, what if these lines are not straight? For example, what do I get if I put circles here and inflate this? Will this stay planar? Well, at first, yes, but then, I get a saddle shape. Why is that happening? So I can make these curved shapes. Well, let's understand what is going on here. So again, we kind of come up with an abstraction that explains what's happening. Basically, these tubes go from a flat state into something circular, right? If I put pressure into this membrane, it wants to maximize its volume, which basically wants to make those circular. So what's happening is that because this material is inextensible, it expands vertically, but it contracts horizontally. Okay, so it contracts in plane, but only in one direction. This is not an auxetic. An auxetic would also contract in the other direction. This surface only contracts in one direction and stays the same in the other direction. But effectively what that does is, it assigns a new metric to this surface. So if you look at these circles, for example, the length of the circle stays the same, but the distance between the circles becomes shorter. And for this to work, the structure has to buckle out of plane. Okay, so again, inflation actually assigns a new metric to this flat sheet. And Gauss tells us, well, you know, if we change the metric, we change the curvature. And this is precisely what's happening here. So again, we can take our inverse design pipeline, we take a design surface that we care about, we first do a flattening into the plane, and this is a specific algorithm we developed that I'm not going to talk about here too much, but basically it says, you know, flatten the surface by respecting this anisotropic contraction that these inflatable mechanisms provide. And then we can, you know, draw out, according to the direction of this mapping, these tubes, and then we optimize, right? So optimization basically here means two things. Again, if we look at our very basic gradient-based setup, we get our target surface as input, and we get this initial guess from our 2D parameterizing. This is, again, absolutely crucial. If you start with a random initial guess, no hope whatsoever. And now in our inner loop, we simulate the inflation process. Okay, so we run a simulation that tells us how does this object deform on inflation. And then in the outer loop, we change the initial parameters, meaning our 2D design, so that this equilibrium state more closely approximates our target. So this is a fairly involved optimization. In fact, we're not doing gradient descent at all on this. I don't have time to sort of go into the details, but for those of you who might be familiar with more advanced numerical methods, I'll just drop a few keywords and I'd be happy to discuss things in more detail. And there's also references at the end. But basically, you know, we cannot work with first order methods here. We build a Newton method, or more specifically Newton conjugate gradient method. We really have to go to a higher order information and build this solver very carefully over many months. And there's a lengthy document that describes this in detail. So if you're interested, you know, I can point you to this. But it is an example of where, you know, black box solvers will not work. You know, this is something we've discovered over and over again. Of course, there are powerful numerical tools out there, but if you just plug in your objective function and hope for the best, it will not work. It will not even tell you why it doesn't work. It will just stop and do nothing, right? So this is both the sort of geometric models, the abstractions are fundamental, but then also sometimes, not always, digging deeper into the numerics is necessary. Fortunately, now we have more powerful tools. You know, there's a lot of very useful things for automatic differentiation and libraries that help you build these solvers much faster than in the past. But sometimes you have to dig to lower levels. So what does that look like? Here are some examples, right? So we have these flat two sheets that we fuse together with a laser, and then we can inflate them and they go to the shapes that we want them to go to, which is great. And, you know, we validated this with scans and kind of see, okay, yes, the predictions of our simulations are actually quite good. We also did some structural tests and we had some load testing, but right now we're actually working on that to improve the structural aspects of these surfaces. They are surprisingly stiff, right? If you take an air mattress, you know, it's very floppy when it's uninflated, but once you pump it up and get it to high pressure, it becomes extremely stiff. So this is something we're now optimizing for precisely, and then the range of applications will become even larger. So moving on to a different system, but that also shares some similarities. So far I showed you these auxetics, which have this kind of conformal map, isotropic expansion. We saw the inflatables, which actually contract, right, in a specific way. Now we're looking at linkage or mechanism-based structures. So if you take a regular grid of rigid beams, right, you can build these sort of scissor grids that can deploy, that can expand in the plane. And basically what you have here is rigid beams connected by rotational joints, and they, you know, allow you to deform the structure in this way. Now, what happens if you move away from a regular grid and you have beams that can actually deform, that are elastic? What happens if I try to open this type of structure? Well, something very interesting happens. The linkage is incompatible, right? If it was rigid, it would just block. But if it is flexible, it can now deform and buckle out of plane into 3D shapes. So what's nice about this is, again, we have a structure that is planar when we assemble it. So it's very easy to build. And it deploys in a more or less 1 degree of freedom actuation. We just pull it open. So this requires us to understand elastic beams, right? So, we have a new visitor, nice. So we're studying how elastic beams deform, and we use a model that has been developed in computer graphics, which is quite powerful and has found its way into a lot of mechanical engineering applications as well. So we abstract a beam by a center line and then study its stretching, bending, and twisting energies. And there are specific formulations of these, all in a representation of a piecewise discrete or linear polyline. We can connect these into networks of beams, and now we can simulate their deployment by actuating them with torque at the joint. So if I do this, here's another example. This system settles into some state of minimum elastic energy as I apply these torques at the joints, right? And this is sort of exactly what we're trying to do. Design in this space, defining target shapes and finding layouts that would deploy into a target shape while minimizing their elastic energy. The specific design optimization is similar in flavor. We have, again, a forward simulation in the inner loop, and then an outer step. We have to differentiate through this complex optimization. And what it does is actually, it looks very unimpressive. So what you see here is the optimization in action. You see very few things are actually moving, but that's exactly what we care about, because we don't want to change the design that we're given. We want to just optimize its structural properties. But the outcome is quite drastic. So we really reduce energy and stress in the beams drastically, which actually is the only way to make this work, because these beams, they're elastic, but they're not infinitely strong. So if you don't optimize in this way, there's not much hope that you can deploy the structure. But if you do, you can actually pull these things apart into their target shapes that you designed. You can play with different types of curvature. We built a few of those, and you can deploy them automatically. You don't have to really, just pull them open. I mean, these ropes here are more or less randomly placed. The structure goes into the shape that you designed it for. And again, the simulation and the physical experiments match quite well. We also scaled this up a little bit and participated in a pavilion competition that we actually got the prize for. Here's a deployable grid shell structure that goes from a flat state that you see on the left, and as you pull it open, goes into this spherical state. Here we installed this at EPFL. So yeah, how are we doing on time? Okay, let me still do a quick aside, also because I know Evgeny is interested in this. We did some work on curved weaving, which is building on the same type of functionality, where we basically extended traditional weaving that works with straight ribbons into curved ribbons. And again, we needed a good physical simulation because we are interested in the elastic behavior of these structures and make sure that they stay in a certain shape that we designed for. And I'm not going to go into too much details here because today's talk is about developable structures, and these are not developable, but they allow us to design a lot of interesting shapes. And we actually decided that it could be interesting to combine these deployable eggshells with these curved weaving structures. So, and we built a structure out of bamboo. Here you see a single cylinder that is actually very flexible and very deployable. Right? It has a regular grid structure, and you can deploy it from this thin to very wide section. And then we decided, what can we do to build something more large scale to combine this with weaving? So these cylinders are very weak and very flexible, but if we weave them together, so if we make connections where these deployable structures come together and are interwoven, we can actually build something that is structurally very strong. So here we created this type of threefold node, and we optimized it to reduce stress inside the node. And then we decided to build something bigger out of this. So in fact, we created 36 of those cylinders that you see here aligned on the ground. And then we assembled that by deploying them individually and weaving them together. So at the nodes where 3 cylinders come together, you have to build the connections with these bamboo strips, and then ended up building a fairly large scale structure that, even though each of the cylinders is very weak in their compound state, becomes a very stiff and strong structure. So this is all made with raw, untreated bamboo that we got from the garden of our collaborator. The structure is strong, but it's lightweight, so you can actually lift it up, even though it's 10 meters in diameter, 4 meters 50 high, but people can lift it up with one hand. So it was quite a fascinating exercise to see this combination of weaving and the deployable cylinders that we created. Okay, almost through, last one. So this is one of the more recent projects that actually combines a number of the things that we've seen so far. One thing that is common in all of these three examples I showed you so far is we always have a planar state, and we deploy by transferring material within the surface. So we're basically changing length within the surface, and as a consequence, the structure buckles out of plane. But this is limited, right? The auxetics can only stretch so much. The inflatables can only contract so much. And these linkage-based mechanisms also have limits in how much they can expand or contract. So that limits the space of shapes that you can assume. The idea of the last project I want to show you is that we can also transfer material transversely. So from the third dimension into the plane. And this gives us actually, in principle, unlimited expansion and contraction. And with that, a much richer space of shapes. How does this work? This literally was inspired by umbrellas. So that's why we call it umbrella meshes. So here's an abstracted mechanism of an umbrella deploying, right? So again, you have these sort of scissor linkages, but now as I push these two plates together, the structure is expanding sideways. And of course, we can measure this expansion. It's just a simple formula that tells you how much will this area of this dotted triangle increase as I push this umbrella open. If I now take a tessellation of these umbrellas and put them together, then what I end up with is a uniformly expanding structure in the plane. This is very similar to the auxetics, right? In fact, it's the same type of expansion, and we can use the same type of mechanism. But what happens if I now change the height of the umbrella? So if I take two umbrellas with different heights, then they will actually expand at different rates into different areas. Okay, so here this is all nice and compatible, but if I put them together and I let them expand, they will not be compatible anymore. At some point, some parts expand more than the others, and of course we know our friend Gauss has something to say about this, right? If there's changes in length, then we get curvature. So here we have flexible beams. With rigid beams, the structure would just lock, right? Similar to the eggshells, where we have these elastic beams, the structure settles into a minimum of the elastic energy. But the expansion here is actually very similar to the auxetics. It's isotropic, which means we can leverage our conformal map formalism. And this is just our friend Gauss, right? So the pipeline is actually very basic, similar to what we've seen before. We take our target surface, we compute a conformal map that tells us how high these umbrellas should roughly be. It's almost there, not quite. So we run our optimization and approximate the target shape more or less perfect. And this is what the simulation looks like. So we have our very compact umbrella mesh. As we expand it, these beams rotate and deform, and the structure approximates the given target surface. If we build this, you see a sort of prototype that we made, and it very closely matches the shape that we assume. What's very nice about these structures is that they're very compact in their undeployed state. So we can even 3D print something in a single piece, right, like this one here, and then deploy it to a structure. So there's quite a few benefits of doing this in a very compact state. We have this property of unlimited scale factors. So I didn't go into details here, but if you look at the auxetics, you can prove that at most you could approximate half a sphere. At that stage, you have exhausted the limit of curvature variation that you can have. But here we don't have these limits. We can actually make these height variations as big as we want, right? There's no limit in the stretch factor that we can achieve. And this is sort of a physical prototype we made of that spherical shape. It also gives us a lot more design freedom. I can approximate the same shape with many different umbrella meshes. So there's lots of theory around conformal maps. A conformal map into the plane always exists. It's Riemann's uniformization theorem. But there's many different conformal maps that you can compute. So that gives us a lot of design freedom. Again, the optimization would not work without the conformal map, right? So this is not something you can just do easily. You need to understand the geometric structure of the problem. So if I summarize these 4 projects that I've showed you, the input in this design, in this inverse design, is the target state. We want to specify what our structure should deploy into. The output of the algorithm is the fabrication state. That's what we can build physically, and we can build it in easy ways. So the first 3 examples are all planar. The 4th one is actually stress-free, which is very important. So you can build these cells and assemble them. There's no internal stress in the system. So what's important to make these simulations and optimizations predictive is accurate modeling of the physics, right? So this is a lot of work goes into finding the right physical representations and models so that our prediction is actually accurate. Of course, we want to simulate these things as much as we can, but not more than necessary to get the right accuracy. And we do build these solvers specifically for each problem. There's a lot of similarities that we can reuse, but I would really want to stress that the key thing to make this work are using the right geometric abstractions. That's sort of the main message, to study the geometry and to leverage all of these fundamental results that people have made. Sometimes that requires digging deeper into some of the math. So I didn't go into that too much. I showed you our friend Gauss, but there's of course more things that people have discovered in differential geometry that you can leverage. And if you allow me a few more minutes, then I'll do a very brief outlook to where we want to take this next. And for that, I show you very rapidly a project that we did with Tim Chen and Pedro Rice on programmable materials. So here we built a system that allows us to change the properties of a material by magnetic programming. So we have this unit cell that you see on the left, which is a bistable cell. Bistable here means that we have a shell, this purple part, that can be in 2 states that are both mechanically stable in themselves. So if I turn on the magnetic field, I can switch the cell from one state to the other. And the key point here, you see this sort of actuation as you switch the magnets. Okay, the magnet goes up or down, not very spectacular. But the main point and the way the cell is designed is that these 2 states have drastically different mechanical properties. So if the cell is in this state here, you see how, as I compress it, these green beams get into contact with the purple structure relatively late. If it's in the other state, they are in contact almost immediately, and that makes this system much more stiff. Right? So now we have a unit cell that we can program to be in 2 different states and have 2 different mechanical behaviors. You can assemble more of these cells into more complex materials. But the main point here is really that we now have a material that is not static, but that can be reconfigured in terms of its mechanical property. And this principle, I think, is very interesting in general, right? So all of the structures that I've showed you before are, once they're fabricated, they're static. Static in the sense that they go to one target shape and that's what they're happy with. But if I want to deploy them into a different shape, well, I have to build a different structure, right? So they have a lot of benefits. They're very easy to fabricate because they are going from planar to 3D. The deployment is automatic. This is something that I think is fundamentally important. So the target state is encoded into the material. And this is something I didn't spend too much time on, but they're also structurally performant. So for very low weight, you get very good structural performance. And as I showed you in some of these examples, we can get a very accurate representation of the target. Again, there's many questions around this, what shapes are attainable and which shapes are not. And some of that you can answer by mathematical analysis. Some of that is unknown. But this question of, can we do multiple target shapes in the same structure? Can we maybe deploy with certain reactions to changes in the environment? Can we control the transfer of force as these structures deploy? This is of course moving towards almost like robotic or soft robotic applications. Can we get more intelligence into these systems? And I think the way to do this is to build sort of more intelligent systems and bring some of that programmability into these structures. Now, I don't want to build fully actuated robots, right? a big part of the intelligence lies in the geometric structure and the material itself. So one, I think, very fascinating question is, how can we build in a minimum amount of programmability, if you will, something that requires very little in terms of control logic, but that gives us a lot more flexibility and allows us to build, structures that maybe can be adaptable and can, react in certain ways. So this is something that we're looking into quite a bit right now. And I think it's a wide open space. And yeah, I'm excited to see where this takes us. So if you're interested more, I mean, here's a list of references. I'm happy to share, of course, these slides, and I think the video is recorded. You'll find all of that on our webpage. You'll find there also software. So we're actually now in a big push to release much more of our code. But if you're interested in some of these methods, some things are already there, but we're working hard to make more things available. And often we try to make them available in ways that don't require you to dig deep into our solvers. But for example, this weaving app is at least right now more for visualization, but very soon also for design. We try to interface with architects and things like Rhino and Grasshopper. So if you're interested in this, check it out. And then, of course, I really want to thank again all the people who, and this is not a complete list, this is just sort of the inner core. There are lots of collaborators that participated in these projects. I started collecting photos, but then at some point I gave up because the slide was so full. So, there's literally dozens of people involved in these projects, and their creativity and hard work makes this all come together. So I'm very, very grateful to be working with so many fascinating people. So thank you very much. I realized I was going over time a little bit, maybe going fast in certain points, but I'd be very happy to dig deeper into any domain that you've seen or any questions. And also, as I said, feel free to contact me at some later point. Happy to discuss more with you. Thank you.
Mark, thanks. Here's a round of applause. Really enjoyed your talk. I'll open up for questions. I guess one thing is, if anybody wants, you can enter questions. There's a question and answer box, or I think we have a manageable number of people. So if people do want to unmute and ask questions directly, that's, I think, also okay.
I could ask a question. Thanks, Mark. I've seen the work before when I was in NCCR ETH, but it's nice to always see a newer version or the update. A quick question on the bottom picture, the middle one, where you actually get the form. If there are external load applied after this form is taken, there's a deformation, right? That applies to the,
yes, absolutely.
And that can be measured in terms of calculated. And I'm assuming, looking at your later work, the 3D, there's probably potential to integrate some sort of a system where you could lock into the shape in a certain load, saying snow load or wind load, to lock yourself in that shape, right?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, the bistable auxetics have a dilemma. Because, well, right now this structure is laser cut out of a single piece of material. And because we need these joints to be compliant, we want something that is soft. But at the same time, we want the elements, the triangles and these little flower shaped things to be as rigid as possible. So if you really want to make this work well, you would probably need to combine different materials, because we have to find a trade-off between the flexibility of the joint and the rigidity of the elements. So if you do this in larger scale, in any case, you would assemble this. And what's interesting is actually, this structure is bistable, and the low energy state is the flat one, right? That's the one it was fabricated in. This still has residual energy. It's actually very hard to push it back to its original state. So if you push your finger on one of these domes, it will, of course, deform, but it will jump back into this state, not into the flat state. And we don't fully understand yet why that is. But structural aspects are now playing, I would say, a much more fundamental role in our optimization. Right now, we've mostly targeted, shapes to say, okay, we want this to deploy in this shape. We want that state to be stable, but not necessarily paying a lot of attention whether this is a strong state, as it's, whether it can bear load in certain cases. And what we're looking at more and more is to integrate load-bearing behavior into the objective function to say, you know, this is going to be exposed to wind load or some payload or self-weight. How can we optimize for this as well? Because there's a lot of freedom in optimization here, right? There's many parameters that we can tune. It does get difficult, right? These inverse problems, I hope I conveyed that to some extent, are not trivial. They're already very hard to solve. And if you add these things, so just to give you an example, what we're doing is for something like the inflatables or also the eggshells, you can do modal analysis, right? You can analyze the sort of deformation mode, the stiffness of the structure in the deployed state, which, you know, typically you do by some eigen analysis. That's fine. Analysis is fine. We can analyze, but now we want to optimize, right? And then basically, you know, differentiating through an eigenvector of a, you know, very complex nonlinear, yeah, it just adds a whole other level of complexity to something that's already very complex. So again, the naive approach will not work. You know, just throwing automatic differentiation at this and hoping for the best is not going to be a solution. But we're beginning to understand the problems better, and I think for, you know, we have some hope to approach these problems. But they're very interesting and they're fundamental, of course, right? You want to deploy these things into a structurally performant system. One aspect, of course, that also plays in a lot is scale, right? I mean, you know, there's of course some small scale things you can laser cut out of a single sheet, but at larger scale, you know, these things don't, I mean, the geometry in many instances is scale invariant, but the physics is not, right? I mean, the material properties change and all of these things. So all of these factors have to be brought in, and that's why there's no sort of one single solution that will always work. You know, you have to look at the specifics of your problem and exploit as much as you can the knowledge about your specific problem domain, be it, you know, specific geometric properties, material properties, and so on. For example, when we worked with the bamboo, this was new to me completely. Before, we were working with industrial products like glass fiber, where, you know, you have very clearly specified material properties. Working with bamboo, which is, you know, not behaving in any predictable way, was very interesting. And what we learned was that it's really the network that makes it all work. Each individual piece of bamboo is very different, you know, in stiffness, in size, and scale, everything. But if you connect them, there is a surprising resilience and equalization of, you know, these sort of effects. So that was fascinating, and that's also something I'm very interested in, you know, to work more with natural materials, where there's a lot more uncertainty about each individual piece, and to find, you know, assembly logics or material logics that make that work.
Yeah, I'm just gonna let the next person to ask, but the strength, the strength through geometry, actually, it's quite an interesting area of topic with the minimal surface, for example, that you had. We explored a lot in that area with very weak material, but as soon as they come to minimal surface geometry, because of the geometry, they stay. And it's quite,
exactly.
Yeah. So
no, geometry is the key factor. Absolutely, yes.
Right. I'm going to leave it to the next person. Thank you.
So, Mark, we have a question in the chat, and it's, you know, I wonder if, I'll just read out the question. I wonder if the deployment process, you know, basically the process from, you know, going from flat to the deformed state is in any case considered during the optimization process.
Yeah, that is actually a very good question. And the answer is probably no, or at least not directly. So for example, if you take the inflatables, right? If I just quickly go back to this, if you look at these videos, you know, air comes in a central point and it distributes around in some random way. And we don't know, right? And in fact, what could happen here, and we saw this in one of our examples, if it inflates in the wrong way, you might actually block just by contact some paths, and then you have to push it a little bit to actually go into this. So here we don't take this temporal aspect of the deployment into account at all. For the grid shells, it's a little bit different because this is a much more coupled system. You know, this is almost like you could pull it at one point and the forces will propagate very easily through the system. But again, we're not taking that specifically into account. What we're optimizing for is the elastic energy of the final structure and the initial structure. And what we observed just empirically is that energy sort of gradually increases for these eggshells. But what we also discovered, and this is something we want to study more for the umbrellas and also for a new version of the eggshells that we did, these structures can be bistable. So you pull them open and normally they would just collapse back, but we get also multi-stable states where they actually settle into a different local minimum and don't go back to the original state. It's not something we can control at this point. And one very interesting and fundamental question in general for these transformable systems is, what is the optimal deployment path? How do you actuate the system in an optimal way? And for example, what kind of energy barriers do you have to cross if you have multi-stable systems? Because right now we don't know, and sometimes we observe this, but we don't understand why they're there, when they're there. We cannot predict this. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of more interesting work to be done to take that deployment process actually really into account in these systems.
One more question here. Since part of these structures seem to deform at very different rates, do you have to consider inertial effects, or is it most often just a quasi-static analysis to characterize the deployment?
Yeah, we all our simulations use a sort of quasi-static assumption. So we solve for these equilibrium states and we do not take into account the dynamics, which is actually also something that I think is very interesting. Sort of alluding to this, can you generalize this type of deployment to, let's say, motion or force transfer? And, then these dynamic effects come into play. But right now, our equilibrium solves are making sort of quasi-static assumptions, meaning that motion is negligible in some sense. It's a simplification of the problem that at this stage is absolutely necessary, I fear. Yeah. But again, if you have a specific example, for example, these inflatables are, of course, also used for building actuators, grippers, all kinds of soft robots, right? And I think that's an interesting domain. A lot of optimization there is done, I think, with very specific constraints, with a very specific application in mind. But that's a big space to explore. And there, of course, motion and the dynamics and inertia and all of these things really play a fundamental role.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'll open up. I have questions I'll ask, but I'll open up if anybody else wants to unmute and ask, or if they want to enter any other questions in the chat box. So, Mark, I kind of, along with the topics of discussion that Manya, I have similar questions with respect to stiffness. Geometry affects stiffness tremendously, right? But more kind of going in the other direction of, the multi-stability aspects, I think, are very important and exciting. And I know that you showed some cases where you modify the structure to minimize the stress in systems. I'm wondering, have you thought of, can you now start to program self-stress into the system? As that could be an option to have the stability programmed into your design.
Yeah, I think this is very interesting. So all the examples I showed you have a sort of there's one exception, but they have a sort of zero energy rest state, right? So we have a state that we can fabricate in laser cut or assemble without having to worry about stress. Actually, this is not true for the eggshells, because if we connect planar or straight beams into an irregular grid, you have to actually bend them in plane to make that work for the type of grids that we look at. So there is residual stress in the system. And of course, you could exploit this also, for example, either for like self-deployment. You already inject energy into the system and it would automatically deploy without external actuation. Or and I guess what you're describing is to stabilize the system in a way that these individual elements that are pre-stressed work together to lock into a geometrically favorable state. I think this is, again, a very interesting topic. We haven't explored this a lot at this point, but this question of multi-stability, for example, it's almost uncanny in the last 6 months, has popped up in almost every project that we worked on. So there's a couple of things that are currently under review and we're not allowed to talk about them very strict ETSA graph. But multi-stability popped up everywhere, and we were really intrigued. Now, multi-stability is of course, like in the programmable material things, we exploited it directly and designed for it and so on. But it's a fundamentally interesting topic, because if you know that you have two stable states, what would be exciting to know is how do you go from one to the other in some sort of least action path. I mean, even knowing the energy barrier between two states is very difficult. I mean, if you have a 1D space, sure, you can sort of sample it and calculate it. But if your space is 1,000 dimensional, like which path you would take to get from state A to state B that has sort of the least amount of energy to actually quantify the energy barrier is not obvious at all. And I think these are very interesting questions to look at. Yeah.
So maybe I'll ask one more question, and I'm very excited about the kind of the future vision you outlined of if you could program material properties. So, you know, you showed kind of the example of stiffness and kind of mechanical behavior in an axial state. But are you thinking to try to program effectively, you know, axial deformation in a material and change that to adapt, to kind of build it into these designs here?
I would love to, you know, sort of this is sort of outside a bit of our capabilities, but you know, if somebody is out there that says, okay, I have this material and I can, you know, either change its stiffness or change its shape with some way that is, you know, easily accessible. Of course, there are a lot of these things, you know, reactive materials that react to heat or water or light or something like this. And I think this is something that has a lot of potential. It's you know, I think we have a lot of tools to work with these. You know, for us, it doesn't matter whether the change is triggered by an external stimulus or something that is internally activated within the material. It's just interesting to think about what to do with that, you know, and what kind of functionalities you can create. And I'm just personally very interested in this transformative aspect of these systems, right? Something that changes its geometry and can sort of show certain functional properties that can be achieved by this type of transformation. So I had some interesting discussions with also people that work in chemistry, you know, that really go to the molecular level and want to adapt material properties. And there's a huge amount of work in material science, and you know, it's such a huge space. And I think we as computer scientists can also sort of build a bridge between, you know, this kind of, let's say, physical, mechanical, chemical work and then the application side of it, right? I think there's still a huge gap between some of the things also in fabrication. You know, we can print so many things, but designing is very hard because a lot of these optimizations are difficult. So what we're trying to do also is help people that, you know, maybe have new capabilities in terms of the materials or the physical systems, but don't have the right tools to exploit these capabilities yet. And I think there's lots of opportunities there.
Thanks, Mark. Well, it was a great discussion. I mean, I'll open up again to anybody, but you know, if we don't have any more questions, I think you know, topics for discussion. So I think this was great. We really enjoyed it.
I have one question if you have time for one
more.
more.
Of course, yeah, of course.
Okay. A real quick question. In the inflatable, if I might be wrong, but I'm assuming the surface curvatures are the optimal path where you want to have the blowing, and then it takes the shape toward optimal form, right? And then this is targeted toward one optimal option. Whereas in the earlier project, the ones that was flexible, that you can take many shapes, those are the options where you can apply the multi-stability. I'm assuming, just asking here, like it's a question, because they seem to be, that seems to take a lot.
So yes, it's true that in pretty much all of these examples, we optimize for one target shape. But even the inflatables, we observed multi-stability. Right, so if you inflate it like this, then normally it goes into that shape. But there are other shapes. For example, the one you see here on the top left, there's a little inward bump, and you can push that bump out. It
Yes.
has a higher energy, but it's still a local minimum, so it will stay, right?
But then
So
also,
that,
sorry, in the surface 3D, they have the
Yeah.
same they have the same surface curvature here, and then when you bump it down, it takes the same.
yes,
Okay.
that we have in any case, right? But that's not the most interesting, right? If you have something like that's planar, a bump goes up or it goes down, that's sort of more or less the same shape, and that could happen locally, right? Some bumps could go up and some bumps could go down, and controlling that is not trivial. But this is something we have a reasonably good handle on. But we also have shapes that go from a spherical shape into a saddle shape, and both are stable, right? So completely different curvature profiles. And this is something I'm quite fascinated in. This is different from what you see here, right? I mean, of course, these shapes, if you have multiple states, they more or less have the same metric. So you wouldn't go from negative curvature to positive curvature. But for other systems that we study, this is the case. So this is something that we have to understand better, for sure.
Thank you. Very exciting.
All right. Well, thanks, Mark. This was really great. I just also thank you, Esther, for organizing and for making all of this possible. So
Yeah.
No, thanks a lot for having me.
Actually, sorry, in the chat, there's one.
Oh, there is a question.
oh, there is.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I missed that one. Have you done any designs with bimetallic strips that bend with heating?
Not yet, but I always wanted to do that. I'm interested in any actuatable material, and I think these bimetallic strips are fascinating. And there's all kinds of super interesting work with surfaces that expand with water, with temperature, with So I think they all offer this type of interesting programmable design, right? By shaping them in the right way, you can control the behavior in which they deform and which they deploy. And then specifically now, I think what's interesting is to not just look at their shape change, but also their force transfer. That like how much force do you exert on certain parts of the surface to be able to do certain kinds of deformation. So I think we have now a lot of machinery. So, if we have a material system like this, we have a recipe. We look at the geometry, we come up with some interesting abstractions, we throw it at our inverse pipeline. Often, it takes a couple of months or sometimes years, and we come up with something. But the possibilities are endless, and then if you think about combining some of these things, combining inflatables with auxetics, with eggshell, this type of material and that type of material, you can, it's a big space out there. But if anybody has interesting shape-shifting materials that they don't know what to do with, I'd be curious to look at it.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Jim, for the question.
Okay, and
Well,
I really hope that there will be an opportunity for me to visit you guys as well, because I did some research and saw all the great stuff that's happening that I won't be able to see now, but hopefully some other time.
Yeah, hopefully we'll have you in person. Hopefully your leg will be better and you recover quickly, and we'll have you in person sooner or later. So
sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Mark.
Well, thanks so
everybody.
much.
All right.